this video, I'm going to show you 6 dark but extremely powerful psychology hacks that I've used to close millions of dollars in deals, and that business owners and closers I've trained have leveraged to master the art of high ticket sales. But be warned, these tactics are genuinely so powerful that beyond just helping you to close more deals and make more money, they will also give you the ability to actually manipulate people by changing the way that you communicate. So let's begin. Now, one of the most powerful sales tactics and psychology hacks that you can use on your calls is simply to engage in active listening. And I'm not joking when I say this. When you do this properly, it's like you are able to read somebody's mind. So what actually is active listening? Active listening is not just paying attention to what somebody says, it's paying attention to the way that they go about saying it. And the reason why this is critical is because a lot of the time there is so much more information that is communicated in the way that something is said as opposed to what is just said unto itself. So what comprises active listening? What are the key things that you actually want to be looking out for? First and foremost, it's tonality. The second thing is the verbiage that they are using and why they have gone about choosing to use that specific type of verbiage. Beyond that, it's paying attention to silence, and when they use silence, whether that's over a long period of time or whether that's just within the sentences themselves. And then the crucial thing is paying attention to all of these 3 factors and seeing how they change over the course of the call. So to give you a better understanding of what all of this looks like, in terms of an example for tonality, right? We could take the exact same sentence where you might ask the prospect, does that give you a little bit more clarity? And they could say, yeah, it does. Versus they could say, yeah, it does. The same words are being said. The first one suggests that they have hesitations, they have doubts, they have questions to be asked. The second one actually demonstrates that they do have the clarity and the confidence that they were looking for. So it's absolutely imperative that you're engaging in active listening and paying attention to the prospect's tonality throughout the duration of the call. Now, another thing that you really want to pay attention to is the verbiage that they are using. Prime example, best example that I can give you is when you're dealing with a partner objection, because there is a massive difference between a prospect saying, I want to go and have a conversation with my team versus I need to go and have a conversation with my team. If you're not able to pick up on that small, tiny little nuance, that blip in the conversation, the difference between the want and the need, it might mean that you give up on the call. Because in the first situation, the prospect is saying to you, I am lacking in confidence, that is why I want to go and have a conversation with somebody else. In the second situation, they are saying to you, I have absolutely got to go and have a conversation with this person for me to be able to progress. Thirdly, silence. The way that the prospect uses silence in their speech will give you an indication of whether they have clarity, confidence, or hesitation. Let's say, for example, you asked them the exact same question that we asked earlier on. Does that give you more clarity? And they say, yes, it does, right? There is a big difference between yes, it does and yes, it does. The second situation sounds like an incomplete thought. It sounds like there's more questions that could be asked. Sounds like there's more confidence that could be given. And the key thing is seeing how all of these elements change over time. Are we seeing the prospect going from a state where they constantly keep engaging in upward inflections, which suggests that they've got questions and that everything is not really that clear to them, to being in a state where they're engaging in downward inflections, where everything seems to be a lot more certain and it's clear that they understand what is actually going on? And beyond that, if we're looking at the verbiage side of things, earlier on when you were asking them about the product or how they perceive the value, have they gone from saying something to the nature of it's okay to now being in the position where they're saying it's good or it's great or it's what I am looking for? Okay, so really, really crucial. I cannot begin to explain to you how important it is that you actually engage in active listening, because it will give you so much information and guidance on what you actually need to do on the call to get the deal to close. Beyond this, we have controlling the conversation. Now, the crucial thing with all of this is when you're on a call, and I see this a lot of the time with business owners and I see this a lot of the time with closers, they think that they need to keep talking and talking and talking and talking in order to be able to control the conversation. But the reality of the situation is the person who is asking the questions is the one who is guiding the conversation. It is really, really important that you ask good strategic questions where you're providing optionality, so it feels like for the prospect they are actually in control of the conversation because they're talking the most. But because you are setting up your questions and you're thinking strategically in 2-3 steps ahead, you are actually the one who is controlling where the conversation goes. To give you a prime example of what a good question would look like versus a bad question would look like, say for example, you recognize that the prospect still has some hesitations after going through the pitch. A lot of the time what business owners will do is say, okay, do you have any questions for me? If you ask, do you have any questions for me? It's a bad binary question, because it ultimately means the prospect can say yes or say no. And even if they do say yes, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to tell you the question, and therefore you have to ask them, well, what questions do you have? And so it's far better for you to immediately go to that second state. What questions do you have for me about X? There you're setting guardrails in place for the direction that you want the conversation to go with X. What questions do you have for me about the product? What questions do you have for me about the appointment booking system? What questions do you have for me about the sales system? But also you're making an assumption, so it's a lot less likely that somebody's going to turn around to you and say, no, I don't have any questions, when they actually do. And the crucial thing to understand about controlling the conversation and asking good strategic questions is, are you trapping yourself with the questions that you're asking, i.e. in the situation where you ask, do you have any questions? And you know the prospect has questions, but they say no. They've just subconsciously engaged their brain to give that type of response. In that situation, you are trapping yourself. Versus, for example, where you might ask a question where you're dealing, say, for example, with someone in a state of fear, where you ask them, hey, are you willing to allow fear to get in the way of you making 20K per month? Very, very difficult for the prospect to say, yes, I'm willing to allow fear to get in the way, right? In that situation, you are trapping the prospect. So it's really, really important that you control the conversation throughout the entirety of the call. Okay, so the third psychology hack that you can use to close way more deals on your calls is tactical silence. Tactical silence, if you do this in the right way, will add way more weight to your speech. To give you a prime example of this, the power of tactical silence is that it will add weight to your speech. Doesn't really feel all that impactful, right? But if I do it in a slightly different way, where I break up my cadence a little bit, the power of tactical silence is that it will add way more weight to your speech. It completely changes the message that is being communicated. It makes it seem so much more important. There's so much more emotion that is tied up in the sentence unto itself. And so it's really important, especially when you're pitching, or especially when you're handling objections, that you leverage silence tactically to be able to help you to convey conviction. And on the other side of this, whilst obviously it does make your speech sound a lot more impactful and the thing that you're saying sound a lot more important, if you highlight it in the conversation by having a gap, by having a break, you give the prospect the opportunity to be able to absorb the information that you're conveying. So it's really, really important for you to go about leveraging tactical silence when you're in the pitch, when you're talking about something that is a crucial piece of information, and then just holding that silence for a couple of seconds to let it really sink in. Another thing that you can do when it comes to tactical silence is using that silence as a way to buy you time to be able to respond. You see this with exceptional speakers like Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk, etc. When they're posed a question, they do not always immediately respond. They're happy to take 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes even 10 seconds before they actually respond to the question at hand. And a lot of people think that if you're holding that silence, it's going to create awkwardness on the call, because the prospect is no longer going to see you as an authority or see you as an expert, but it actually has the opposite effect. Because when you hold that silence after getting a question to really consider what it is that you're going to say, you're able to build more trust and more rapport with the prospect, because it demonstrates that you're actually considering the question in depth and you care about the response that you're actually going to give. So don't be afraid to use silence as a way to buy you a little bit of time in the calls. You can't obviously do it all the time, but especially when you're faced with difficult questions, there's nothing wrong with holding silence for a little bit. Now, there's 2 other ways that you can go about using silence on your calls. These are more hard closing tactics, so don't love them if I'm being completely honest with you, but they definitely do work. One of those strategies is, after you've asked somebody for a piece of information, if they don't give you the response that you want, you do not respond yourself and you just sit there in silence. And what that will do is make the prospect feel very uncomfortable. and they will realize that they need to give you a little bit more information. But the problem with this is, whilst it does work very well with people who are new to the space of high ticket closing or how new business owners or new closers, when you're dealing with established business owners, it's not going to work. The other side of this is you can use it as a way to build pressure and put pressure onto the prospect after you've delivered the price. So you tell the prospect the price and then you just stay silent and you do not speak until the prospect speaks. Again, this does work incredibly well with people who are inexperienced in a sales environment where they haven't been on many sales calls. But I would not recommend using this. This is a highly manipulative tactic that you can use on your calls. But again, it's not the best way to go about trying to close deals. Now, the fourth psychology hack that you can use to help you to close more deals is getting the prospect to sell themselves on the product. Now, maybe you have seen the film Inception, and if we just look at the whole premise of that story, right? What Leonardo DiCaprio wanted to do was to convince somebody that they needed to sell their business. Now, obviously, he could have just gone to that individual and said, hey, look, sell your business. But he realized that by sowing the seed in their mind, it was much more likely that they would take up that idea. And the same thing is true when you are on your calls. This is why you use strategic questions. This is why you engage in deductive reasoning. This is why you use good binary questions. And this is why you get the prospect to double down on positives so you can get them to sell themselves. To give you an example of what this would look like is a retie. Right? Prospect comes to you, you give them the price, they say, I need some time to think about it. If you say, absolutely fine, go away, have a little think about it. Do you feel like this can actually get you to where you want to be? And they say, well, yeah, I feel like it could. Okay, and what about the process makes you feel like this can actually get you to where you want to be? Now you're getting the prospect to sell themselves on all of the upside, all of the positives, all of the things that are good about the product. Oh, I love the support. I love that you've got predictable systems in place. I love that you have X. I love that you have Y. Okay, so I understand that you like X, you like Y. What else about the process, or what specifically about X makes you feel like that this would get you to where you want to be? Okay, so instead of you pitching, instead of you trying to get the prospect to convince themselves that it's going to work, very subtly, very slyly, very strategically, you are getting the prospect to convince themselves that it is going to work. Now, the fifth psychology hack that you can use on your calls is to speak in absolutes. This is the antithesis of active listening. This is where you are paying very close attention to the verbiage that you use on your call. Because the question that you have to ask yourself is, when you are speaking, are you sowing seeds of doubt or are you sowing seeds of confidence? In terms of speaking in absolutes, this is incredibly powerful when you are pitching. It's also incredibly powerful when you're engaging in objection handling. But essentially what you are doing is you're using language which conveys way more confidence, that's a lot more assertive than something that may be a little bit more suggestive of the fact that you're doubtful about what you do. To give you an example of what this would look like, let's take the exact same scenario, but just presented in two different ways, where perhaps you're going about talking about an appointment booking system. In scenario one, you say, essentially, with these systems in place, you'll get like 2 to 3 appointments per day, basically a 70% sharp rate, and so you should close around 4 to 5 deals a week, right? Doesn't sound all that confident. However, you can say the exact same thing, the exact same structure, but if you sew in a lot more confident language instead of using words like essentially or like or around or kind of, and replace them for more confident language, it completely changes the message that you're communicating. With these systems in place, you will get an absolute minimum of 2 to 3 appointments per week with at least a 70% sharp rate, meaning without question, you will be able to close 4 to 5 deals per week. Obviously, the caveat with this is you need to use this responsibly. You can't just say whatever you want to say and say everything with gusto and confidence just for the sake of it if you're not actually able to deliver on what it is that you're saying. The other caveat of this is you don't always want to speak in absolutes. There's certain situations, say for example, when you know that you're approaching something that's a little bit sensitive. Maybe somebody wants to speak to their partner, they're in a state of fear, you want to do an open wallet check or financial audit. It's better actually in those situations for you to use more tentative language, to sew in probablys, maybes, kind ofs, because then when you're asking a question, to mask what it is that you're actually asking. For example, if you were to ask the vast majority of people very directly, how much money do you have in your savings? A lot of the time they're going to have a knee-jerk reaction where they say, I'm not comfortable talking about that. However, if you were to ask the vast majority of people, okay, and so in terms of the saving side of things, I guess what does that look like? The prospect will understand what the question is, but because it's not so direct, they'll be a lot more comfortable with actually giving you the answer. Now, the last psychology hack is leveraging analogies, and I cannot begin to explain to you how powerful analogies are for helping you to reframe the prospect's perspective. And the reason why is because what you are getting the prospect to do is to apply the logic that they would use in a different situation that is comparable to the current situation. And in doing so, it makes it way easier for them to actually switch their viewpoint. So to give you a prime example of what this would actually look like, let's say, for example, somebody is dead set on the fact, you've gone through the product, you've gone through the process, but somebody is dead set on the fact that they can actually do this by themselves and they don't really need help. Now, obviously I could give them pushback and I can ask them tons of questions and I could pour confidence and conviction into them that doesn't really make sense and it's kind of stupid. But instead, what would be better is for me to build an analogy around that situation. So what I might do is ask a question like, okay, look, John, I know that this is a little bit of a curveball question, right? But what sports are you interested in? Maybe John says, oh, I really like football. Okay, cool. And who's your favorite footballer? Who's, in your eyes, the best footballer of all time? Oh, I think that Ronaldo is absolutely fantastic. Let's say, for example, John, you wanted to get into the position where you were able to play football professionally, right? And you had two different options that were in front of you. In one situation, you're just practicing by yourself. You're going down to the pitch, you're practicing dribbling, you're practicing shooting, you're practicing passing, everything that you need, right, to become a very good football player. But in the other situation, the same 3-4 hours that you're spending every single day practicing alone, instead, you're able to have Ronaldo training you directly. He's teaching you how to pass the best, how to dribble the best, how to go about shooting the ball in the right way so that you can curve it around the goalkeeper and score 40% of the time when you take a shot. In which situation do you think you will be more likely to succeed and actually get to the point where you become a professional football player? In the situation where you're practicing alone, or in the situation where you actually had a coach by your side? Well, John would say, in second situation. Now, at the very end of all of this is when I would then tie it back to the call and the current situation. So John, I guess it's kind of like this, right? Like, obviously, I'm not saying that you can't go away and practice how to go about doing X, Y, and Z. But the reality of the situation is, if you have an expert for X, you have an expert for Y, you have an expert for Z, somebody who's already spent X number of thousand hours learning all of this so you don't have to go through that process of trial and error, do you think that you would be able to get to that goal of 20K per month a lot faster with their help in place or with you doing it by yourself? So those are the 6 dark psychology hacks that I use to close millions of dollars in deals. And as I said, applying even just some of these will dramatically improve your close rate. But as I'm sure you know, being able to absolutely crush it on your calls involves a lot more than just learning some tactics. And so if you'd like to get one-on-one help to scale your business or to become an elite closer, then feel free to click the first link in the description below to have a conversation with me directly. On this call, it will be very low pressure. We're going to have a conversation around some of the problems that you're facing sales-wise so we can figure out whether or not we can actually help you to fix those problems and to make more money every single month. So feel free to click the link, grab a slot, and I will see you just